I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the family of Mavis Robertson, and it is a great honour to give the address which bears her name. I'd like to thank AIST for the invitation and also to commend you for the decision to establish the Mavis Robertson Address as a permanent fixture at your conference. I think that that's a terrific initiative, and it's very important to make space for critical public policy issues to be addressed in forums such as these. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the super sector and all of you. Your sector has more than played your part in elevating women's interests and in advancing women. Super funds have seen women in senior roles, often well in advance of other industries. Trailblazers like Mavis helped make sure there was a place for women at all levels of the industry and ensured that there were bodies like Women in Super which could actively consider and promote women's distinct economic interests. More broadly, from the very beginning, your sector has played an incredibly important role in broadening the national conversation about retirement, for both men and for women. And the contribution isn't just historical. I've seen it firsthand over the last 8 months through my role in chairing this Senate inquiry, and I have been impressed and incredibly grateful for the thorough and well-researched contributions that have been made to the inquiry by your sector. And I really do want to take today as an opportunity to thank all of you who've made those contributions and put the energy into this process that I believe is making it a successful process. I want to talk today about some of the lessons learned from the inquiry, but more than that, I want to talk a little bit about change, both in the past and in the future. There's really been a huge shift in attitudes towards women's economic welfare in the last 30 years. Most of us now, sitting in this room, want women to succeed and want women to be equal. And I want to talk today about how that goodwill, what I would assert is a historic level of goodwill for this cause, can be used to improve outcomes for women over the next 30 years. As you heard from Cate, so many things in the super sector actually started with Mavis, so I think it pays for us to start there too. So superannuation may have been or seemed a long way from the anti-war and the anti-apartheid causes that had caught the imagination of Mavis Robertson as a young person. But for Mavis Robertson, super was something more than just a financial product. In her own words, superannuation is no longer a prerogative of the rich. It's a right, no longer a privilege. And so from the early 1980s, Mavis poured her passion into the fledgling superannuation sector. She was instrumental in the founding of CBUS. She initiated this conference, the Conference of Major Superannuation Funds, and she was instrumental in establishing programs to develop the capabilities of super trustees. And importantly, for today's topic, she also initiated Women in Super. Now, none of this would have been easy. In fact, I think it would have been very hard. As a woman who was active in both the union movement and the finance sector in the 1980s, I can only imagine, though I didn't meet her, that Mavis would have been one very tough cookie. The adjective most commonly used about her is fierce. I have rung a number of her friends and comrades over the last couple of weeks to understand a little bit more about Mavis and what she offered, and fierce comes up quite a lot. One suspects that this was the only way through for a woman who inhabited a world that was overwhelmingly run by men. Now, that world has changed. Mavis would not have had, I imagine, as receptive or as open an audience as I have today if she was to stand up and seek to talk about women's economic outcomes way back in 1984. We've seen a seismic shift in attitudes on this question in my adult life. Both men and women now value women's equality in a way that would have been inconceivable to many a generation ago. Despite this, and despite this goodwill, outcomes for women haven't kept pace with attitudes. Australian women are still economically worse off than men. Women earn less. On average, they earn on something like $284 less per week than men. And they own less. Women retire with half the superannuation balances of men, and as a consequence, it's estimated that 38% of single women will retire in poverty. And the situation isn't actually getting any better. It's getting worse. The gender pay gap has grown steadily for years, and women today are earning less, on average, relative to men than they were 20 years ago. So I want to use today's speech to argue for one solution, not the total solution, but to just make the case for one of the pieces in the puzzle. We need to make sure that when governments are making economic policy, we analyse how these policies affect women. And I know that sounds simple, but we actually don't do this as a matter of course at the moment. It's a little bit like this old children's book about a frog. And this is a frog who throws a dinner party for his large and charming group of animal friends. And I'm sure if there are any parents in the room, you will know the kind of book that I'm talking about. So after all day, frogs in the kitchen, we reach the climax of the dinner itself, where a table of very cute squirrels and owls and rabbits are left staring in disbelief at the plate of flies that is served to them by the beaming frog. Now, there are obviously limits that you can draw to the moral of this story. You can only be expected to do so much for fussy dinner guests. But it does speak to a fundamental truth. If you don't pay attention to the differences in how people live, you run the risk of serving them a plate of flies. And the proposition I want to put to you today is that, like the frog, we're not paying attention to difference. Men and women have different economic interests, and our policies in a range of areas don't account for this. So I want to put forward two quite specific changes. When major policies go before Cabinet, they should include a separate analysis of their impact on women, on the gendered nature of their effect. And secondly, we should reintroduce women's budget statements. We actually used to have them. They were introduced by the Hawke and Keating government, but they were gutted by Mr Howard before being entirely abolished by Mr Abbott. In their day, however, they set out the impact of a budget as a whole on women. And the reason I think this makes a difference is because policymakers are oblivious. They're not malicious. Men and women have very different economic interests, and we are simply not sufficiently alert to how these interests interact with different policies. So I'll explain in more detail in a moment, but women work, save, invest, spend differently to men. And because of this, policies that don't take account of the different economic lives of women run the risk of producing inferior outcomes for women. And that is what I think has happened in some parts of our taxation and our retirement systems, as just two examples. Just because our policies are gender blind, it doesn't mean that they are gender neutral. So what are the differences in the economic lives of men and women? In 1960, the most popular baby girl's name in Australia was Mary. So let's look at our hypothetical average Mary. She's born a little bit before me, and she marries David, which was also the most popular boy's name in 1960. Mary takes a couple of years out of work to care for each of her 1.93 children. Like 46% of working women, she works part-time. And industries in Australia are heavily divided by gender. So she probably works in a low-paid industry like retail, healthcare services or education. And even if she's working in a relatively mixed industry, maybe like finance, the occupations in these mixed industries are heavily divided by gender. So there's a very good chance that she has a lower paying job in doing feminised tasks. Mary does more of the housework, and when Mary's parents get older, she picks up the responsibility of caring for them. And she also helps when David's parents get sick. She has some limited super, but like most women, she selected lower yielding but less risky investments. She has a different pattern of spending from David, so she spends more on healthcare, as just one example. And so when we look at Mary, what we can see is that she has a completely different economic footprint from David. As a worker, as an investor, as a consumer, and a family member. And what that means is that it's not just the so-called women's issues like childcare and parental leave that can have an oversized impact on women. Instead, our general policies have the ability to produce very different outcomes between men and women. Retirement policy is a perfect example of this. My Senate inquiry has been looking at women's retirement, and we've heard a lot of thoughtful analysis from academics, from industry, and from women and those who represent their interests, like unions and women's advocacy groups. And I imagine that many of you are keen to know what the inquiry will be recommending, but I am afraid I have to keep you waiting on that front just a little bit longer until we finish our work and I gain agreement from my colleagues about how we're going to approach it. But what I can share today are some of the lessons that I've personally taken away from the evidence that's been given to the committee. It's been impressed on me by countless witnesses that superannuation works best if you are working full-time, earning at or above the average wage, without interruptions for your adult life. Well, that might be David, but that is definitely not Mary. This is what leads to that now notorious statistic that men retire with, on average, almost double the superannuation balances of women. It also helps that they get double the assistance from the government. So twice the amount of superannuation tax concessions from government flow to men than to women, despite women clearly needing the most financial support. Now, there are some things that we can do to make super better for women. Labor has committed to curbing some of these excesses by tackling the generous tax concessions that flow to mostly male high-income earners. And we also recognise the need to do something to assist very low-income earners, and certainly that was the purpose of the low-income superannuation contribution, which I know you're all very familiar with and is due to expire under this government in 2017. The testimony has also underlined for me the importance of maintaining the aged pension. So unlike superannuation, the old age pension has the capacity to guarantee a decent standard of retirement, regardless of someone's income throughout their life. It seems to be more suited in many ways to many women's situations. Not all women, but many women. It is able to recognise the lifetime of unpaid work that women provide to their families and to their communities. So our retirement system needs to be tweaked if we want it to work for women the way that it works for men. The first step, though, is actually having the conversation. And the Senate inquiry process has highlighted the value of taking the time to look. Because when we look at the gender impact of policies, they are not often as equal as they may have first seemed. Retirement is not the only policy area that would benefit from this treatment, however. And in so many policy areas, we are flying blind on gender, which means that our gender-neutral policies are in effect anything but. Take taxation. So we have notionally been having a national conversation about tax reform. And I'll save the political commentary about that perhaps for the panel session. But, you know, we've heard from politicians and interest groups a range of proposals. But what we haven't heard is any gender analysis of these ideas, which is a shame, because these proposals will have gendered effects, or many of them will. So take the GST, for example. We know that women earn less than men, and as a result, women spend a greater proportion of their income on goods and services. It means that the amount paid in GST is a higher proportion of women's incomes than of men's in general. And so increases to the GST would thus, in general, fall more heavily on women than on men. It's also been argued that we should increase the GST to help pay for income tax cuts. Well, we see the same gendered effect potentially when we look here. Again, the key fact is that women earn less than men. So women, in fact, make up more than half the bottom 10% of income earners, but less than a quarter of that top 10%. And what that means is that unless they are carefully designed, income tax cuts are more likely to benefit men than women. And this is what we see when we look at the past decade of tax cuts. The Australia Institute has calculated that women enjoyed only 32% share of the income tax cuts dealt out since 2005. Of the $169 billion handed back to workers, $115 billion went to men and $54 billion to women. It's been argued that we need to address bracket creep to combat increasingly high effective marginal tax rates for upper income earners. However, the highest effective marginal tax rates are actually paid by women. Women are often the second income earners in families, and our tax system penalises women when they go back to work after having children. Families lose part or all of the family tax benefit when women go back to work. And this can mean that when you add in the cost of childcare, these women are worse off working than not working. So it is as though some women are actually paying to keep their careers going. Now, quite obviously, some women are not prepared to make that sacrifice, and so we see a corresponding drop in workforce participation for mothers. Now, there's nothing inherently discriminatory about taxation policy. It applies to all Australian workers, but it doesn't apply equally. Australia's taxation system doesn't work for women in exactly the same way that it works for men. Gender analysis as part of the budget and as part of the policy process would bring these inequalities to our attention. And if we don't take account of these differences, women will continue to go backwards. This is why I think that gender analysis needs to have a permanent place in the way we make the big policy decisions in this country, in the national conversation. This doesn't mean that every single policy has to favour women over men, of course. It doesn't even mean that most policies have to favour women. It simply makes us accountable. There may be good policy reasons why a particular budget is overall detrimental to women, but having a women's budget statement would force governments to at least explain why this is the case. It's not enough, however. It's not enough to have men make decisions for women, even if they are making them with gender analysis in front of them. Part of the answer has to be having more women in the room. So we know that having female decision makers increases the chances of a distinct female interest being noticed and taken into account in a policy process. One of the best examples is the development of paid parental leave under the former Labor government. Prior to 2011, Australia was one of only 2 OECD nations without a national paid parental leave scheme. Having women in the room, like Julia Gillard, Penny Wong, Tanya Plibersek, and of course the indefatigable Jenny Macklin, made a huge difference in getting this on the agenda, keeping it on the agenda, and getting a result. We have to have more women responsible for actually making economic decisions. I am talking about more Penny Wongs as Finance Minister, and yes, more Kelly O'Dwyer's as Assistant Treasurer. We also need more women doing the preliminary economic thinking that goes into making the policy. I'm not just talking about female cabinet ministers here. Instead, I'm talking about having senior women in places like the Productivity Commission and in Treasury. There are some challenges. Less than 40% of economics postgraduate students are women. By the time you get to the upper echelons of serious economic decision makers, that percentage drops much, much further. Just one of the top 7 RBA officials is a woman, and Treasury doesn't have any women amongst its most senior public servants at the moment. Having more female economists is not just about having a more diverse workforce. It changes the nature of the analysis. A recent survey has shown that an economist's gender has a significant effect on their views about the minimum wage, about health policy and labour standards. Policy is not plucked from the ether. It arises from the careful work that's done by people in places like Treasury, people in industry organisations and in think tanks. And having more female economists would mean having more female-conscious policy proposals in the public debate. We have come a long way since Mavis's heyday, although when I reflect on that, it seems that Mavis's heyday may have been rather extended. It seems she was incredibly active and energetic right to the end of her life. But we've come an incredibly long way since Mavis began her career journey. Then half the population thought women's economic equality was an important issue. Now we all do. We have so much goodwill and we need to make sure that we don't squander it. At the moment, we are delivering substandard outcomes to women because we often don't realise the effect that our policies are having on women. Gender blind does not mean gender neutral. Let's take the blinkers off. Let's make gender analysis and female decision makers a permanent part of our policy process. Thank you.
Thank you. There is time for questions, and I should have reminded you that you can submit questions via the AXA IM live Q&A, which is open. And you can do that via the CMSF app, but if you are more traditional or old school, we have people with disco-coloured lights who will come to you with a microphone if you have a question that you wish to ask. So I'll just have a glance out there. I can't see any right at the moment. Jenny, I'll start off if I can in the interim while people get their thoughts together. I guess the first would be just a hard one, an easy one. What do you think are the big ticket items to really leading to greater economic equity between the genders?
Yeah, so I wanted to be clear in the speech that the proposal around gender policy analysis was just one part of the puzzle, but there are, of course, lots of other pieces. I think the big ticket items continue to be access to paid parental leave, and unhappily that is still a policy area that is in some level of flux under the government. We're well behind many other international examples and we really just need to bed that down. We also need to sort out affordable and quality childcare, and that still is a challenge for many families. It's terribly expensive. And I think the third area is workplaces. So one of the things the inquiry's heard evidence about is just how very difficult many women find it combining family and work. And part of that difficulty lies in the fact that good quality jobs, jobs with career prospects, jobs that suggest an advancement over a lifetime of work are very, very rare, very, very rarely offered on a part-time basis. And we've heard lots of evidence of employers, I think, genuinely looking for ways to address that, but a general acknowledgement that Australian workplaces still haven't got that right.
I mean, that's a big agenda that you outlined. So what do you think that this sector in particular can do?
I touched on it in my remarks earlier, but it makes a huge difference having a sector that's willing to engage in the public policy debate. So I worked, before I went into the Parliament, in the private sector, and before that as a public servant. And it is a small but immensely valuable subset of the business community that takes the time to invest resources into understanding and engaging in public policy processes. But when you're in a public policy role, either as a bureaucrat or in the Parliament, when you see those businesses that are willing to put a thoughtful position on the table, step into the shoes of the public, consider the public interest rather than just the narrow business interest. That is an enormously valuable contribution. And that's, I should say, as I mentioned in my speech, that really happened through the super inquiry. And so some of the most valuable contributions and pieces of research have come from the sector, where individual funds have made the decision, or industry bodies have made the decision, to pull resources together and actually put in a serious submission, and it's immensely useful for government. So I don't think you have to push a particular agenda, but just deciding to come to the table is the first step, and it's really, really valuable for decision makers.
And the submissions that I'm aware of from our industry, people have stepped up and organisations have stepped up to try and do the gender analysis so that it's not blanket information that's provided about outcomes, that you can see the impacts on women of different policy decisions that have either been proposed or the current settings.
Yeah, and they've been really wonderful. And the other interesting contribution, I think, has been not just stepping up in terms of doing the analysis, which has been immensely important, but also stepping up and taking a position in the media. So when you're a decision maker trying to push an issue along or get traction on an issue, having other voices saying, this is important, this matters, we need to take this seriously and take a decision, helps enormously.
I would say also that a lot of that analysis and modelling, like AIST's done it through their AIST Mercer Super Tracker, and ISA has done a lot of modelling as well, that it's very interesting that things that were traditionally put forward as being perhaps a solution or part of a solution for women's retirement outcomes or superannuation savings have been shown not to turn the dial very much, particularly a lot of the catch-up or optional activity type policy statements.
So one of the proposals that's often been put forward, as Cate says, is either lifetime caps or some other kind of rollover arrangement that would allow women to catch up. But of course, the evidence before the committee, anecdotally from women's groups, is that most women really don't have the cash to catch up. They're in a low-paying job, they've got multiple commitments against what discretionary income they do have, and making payments in the order of $30,000 to catch up is not a viable strategy. And the modelling from Rice Warner, some of which was included in the ISA submission, shows quite extraordinary levels of contribution would be required for a woman who takes standard career breaks to look after children to catch up. Something like, heading towards contributing 20% of your income in that period of your life where you are working, which is a very big jump from the current 9.5, and just doesn't seem like a viable policy option when you look at it closely.
No, very, very challenging for some women. I think we have a question up the back there.
G'day, Michael O'Connor, National Secretary, CFMEU, co-chair First Super. Thanks very much for your contribution today. Look, I just wanted to, on behalf of our fund, thank you and your colleagues in the Senate for defending industry super. Often we see the Labor Party do great things and defending our members and our funds, and we forget to say thank you. So on behalf of our fund, thank you very much. I know it was a tough battle, and we appreciate it at least. Good on you.
Thanks, Michael. Are all of the questions going to be like this?
I don't know. We've got another one down here. We'll find out.
Thanks. Maria Wilton from Franklin Templeton. Thanks, Senator. That was just terrific. We all really enjoyed that. My question is around women in leadership, role modelling. I think we would probably all agree that those things are important, and having family-friendly workplaces is important. So can you tell us a little bit about the Parliament? Because it doesn't actually seem to be a very great place to work.
Okay, so, well, it is a great place to work, and I don't say this glibly, it's a genuine privilege to be there. One is resourced to be a parliamentarian in ways that I've never previously been resourced in any other job, and so I'd be very reluctant to complain about what it means to be a parliamentarian and the work conditions. There are some real challenges, though, about women, care and Parliament and the way that the Parliament is organised. One of them, and it's been on the agenda of many of those early 1980s feminists who were talking about these questions, is actually that our parliamentary tradition is that people live in their electorates and travel to Parliament. And so it's different to other countries where, like the United States, where parliamentarians generally move their families to Washington. But in the Australian context, one leaves one's family at home. Now, in my case, that's Sydney, and that's, an hour's flight from Canberra. It's a 3-hour drive. It's possible for me to return home to my children should there be some major emergency, and it's also possible for me to get back to them fairly quickly at the end of a sitting week. But it nonetheless creates a pretty big burden on the family relationships, and it asks a great deal of one's husband. And I think that having some sort of conversation about the means by which parliamentarians, both men and women, can keep their families together a little more would be good. People would be horrified if most lower house members shifted their families from the electorate that they represent to Canberra. And I understand why that's the case. It's very important that representatives, have a relationship with the electorate that they represent. But I think we need to acknowledge that that demand places very real costs on the relationships either men and women can have with their children.
Now, we've got a question up here, which is someone's obviously been impressed by your achievement in pulling together bipartisan support for the Senate inquiry. And now there's just a small job, which is to ask whether how you might achieve bipartisan support on an issue like retention of the low-income super contribution.
Okay, well, I don't know if I can achieve bipartisanship on that. I did ask a question about it in the Senate, actually, in question time, and I got a most evasive answer. So I'm not sure that we're heading towards bipartisanship on the list. But I do think that it's important not to be combative in the Senate unless it is absolutely necessary. Of course, there are big questions that divide us from the Coalition and also us from the Greens, but my general philosophy is not to make enemies unless I absolutely need to, and I think just having, honestly, I'm very new at this, might not work out, this might be a bad strategy, but my general approach is simply just to try and be a trustworthy partner, to be honest about how I'm proceeding with my colleagues, whether they're from my party or from another party, and hope that a reputation for honest dealing means that where there are commonalities, we can make progress. I should say that the Deputy Chair of the committee, Sean Edwards, who's a Liberal Senator from here in South Australia, has been most collaborative about this and was on board from the very first moment that I raised it with him. So, props to him.
Well, and to you, I think it's a great outcome. Getting all party support for the inquiry. There's a question here about the role, I'm presuming it's in the context of the inquiry, in the debate around the purpose of superannuation and that consultation process.
Well, the inquiry doesn't have a specific role, but as a parliamentarian, I hope to work with my Labor colleagues in how we engage with that process. There's two things that I think are interesting for me coming out of the inquiry about this discussion about purpose. One of them I mentioned in the formal speech, which is that we have a 3-pillar retirement system, and it rests on the age pension, superannuation, private savings, and private wealth generally. I think arguably there's a kind of 4th pillar, which are the other elements of the social safety net, like healthcare and housing support. But they are the bases of delivering a dignified retirement to all Australians. I do worry that the tone of the debate on occasion leans towards positioning Australia as having a one-pillar retirement system with the age pension as a residual idea for a small group of very, very, very poor Australians. And I don't think that is a realistic prediction of the reality of Australia. I don't think that the modelling suggests that that's where we're heading, and I think that we ought to be careful that whatever we adopt in the objective doesn't lend weight to that particular idea. 3 pillars has been great for us. Super's immensely important in delivering a more comfortable standard of living for the vast majority of Australians, and as the super system's maturing, we can see the benefits of that. Also lots of systemic benefits. So super, an enormously important part of the 3 pillars, but we just need to make sure that we understand it in that 3 pillars context. The second thing is actually one that's been raised with the inquiry, which is, and it goes to today's remarks too, it would be good or interesting to contemplate whether the objective couldn't specifically call out the objectives for both men and women. And even if it simply made that reference to men and women, it might be an enduring reminder for policymakers that these are, that women's issues always need to be considered when we're thinking about how we're delivering on super policy.
Yeah. One of our concerns, well, besides, piecemeal changes to superannuation, are also that there could be changes to tax concessions and whether that's also contribution caps, but that money marches out of the superannuation system and into other general budgetary priorities, and there is nothing done in terms of adjusting the system to deliver better outcomes for women. And I think do you think that's a real danger in the current environment?
Look, I think that, well, speaking for our party, we'd probably always look at the macro settings. We wouldn't say, because you can find savings here, they can only be applied to other policy problems. Because, for example, sometimes we want to find savings in one portfolio area and allocate them to a priority in another, like education. But I do think a balanced approach to any changes to the superannuation system would be important, and there are obviously some big problems at both the top and the bottom end of the system, and it would be good to have a policy response that addressed both of them.
Both ends, yeah. We've got a question just here.
Thank you. Colin Tate, Connexus Financial. Senator, that was a lovely tribute to Mavis, and I'm sure she'll be looking down on both your words and this moment with great pride. My question is in regards to the Turnbull government's proposed changes in the Senate. Yesterday, I was at a conference in Melbourne, and arguably one of the most senior women in Australia, Catherine Livingstone, the chair of Telstra and the president of the Business Council of Australia, argued ferociously that those changes were needed and warranted to protect democracy in Australia. Can you explain to the audience exactly where the process is at and why you're fighting those changes?
So the Labor senators have been really clear that we also believe electoral reform is necessary. No system is perfect, and it is certainly the case that the current Senate electoral system is not perfect. Our concern about the government's current changes are that they have been put on the table at the very tail end of a parliament with very limited time for debate or scrutiny. To give you an example, normally a process like this, they're the largest changes to Senate voting in 30 years. No one's saying that change isn't required, but they're big changes. Normally we'd have some kind of public discussion about that, some consultation process. They were sent to a committee which allocated 4 hours for public hearings. At the conclusion of those public hearings at 5 p.m, the committee secretariat went away, wrote the report. Labor senators received that report at 10 o'clock that evening and were required to have any comments or additional thoughts back by 8 o'clock the next morning. That isn't a reasonable way to conduct reform of the nation's parliament, and that's why we're opposing it.
Thank you. We have a question here, just moving to a different topic, about aged care, whether that's on your agenda, your personal agenda as well.
Well, actually, it is. But I do have problems managing the many things that are on my personal agenda, but that is on the list. One of the observations I'd make about aged care, and it comes from some of my family experience, is that I think that we need to consider opportunities for residents in aged care to play a greater role in determining the nature of their day-to-day experience and having more control and more contribution to how they live. And the kind of example I'd give is this. I've had a number of family members in aged care institutions, and for the most part their health needs have been adequately addressed in that environment. But I think their emotional needs and their need to be stimulated to continue to contribute, to be part of a community, have been much more difficult to meet, despite best efforts of staff and good people around. I think, for example, it would be better for an older person to play a role in preparing their own meal, even if they are living in a large facility, or to have a role in folding the washing, or any of those small tasks which actually mean that you have control and are making a contribution to a community, and able to have a voice also, better institutions within facilities for people to speak up about what they want and how they want it and when they'd like it, not to be reduced to resident 49,
Yeah.
That's an exaggeration, of course, and I have very high regard for the people who work in these facilities, but I do think that over time it would be good if we could move, as the population ages and this becomes a larger issue, it'd be good if we could move towards some models of care that better address some of those broader questions.
Thank you. Look, we're just about out of time, unfortunately, so my apologies to the questioner up the back, but I will be frog marched out and shot if I make the conference program out of kilter. I think particularly that last answer, what a wonderful thing to have such a thoughtful and considered representative in the Parliament who brings such a human element to understanding the issues that face the nation. And I think that's a wonderful thing for us to take out of today. In terms of your address, I like the concept of the step one is having a conversation, and I thank you for putting the conversation about women's economic security and retirement firmly in an all-party environment on the national stage and open to contribution, not just by our industry who are interested in these issues, but to the wider community and to all those women's groups who are interested. And to your points about that gender blind is not gender neutral, I think we all need to take that on board, and the need for gender analysis of policy proposals, and would heartily endorse a return to the women's budget. I think we need that returned, and I don't think anyone would object to the concept of more women in the room adds new thoughts, a new dimension and new contributions, and can only be in men and women's interests in society. So thank you for a really thought-provoking contribution this morning. Thank you.